Unit 12, the end of the Cold War, 1981 to 1991. The decade of the 1980s was very different from the decade of the 1970s, both in the world at large and within the United States. So let's look first of all at the world at large of the 1980s. It was a world in which the Soviet Union was crumbling, and the Soviet control, the empire as we like to call it, of the Soviet Union was crumbling in Eastern Europe. And most Americans were aware that the communists were having trouble with their governments, but they weren't really aware of how rapidly this kind of disintegration was taking place. There were uprisings and resistance against communism in Poland, in the Baltic republics. There was an organization in Poland called Solidarity, which was calling for more democratic reforms. There were a group of reformers within Russia who were calling for more openness, the Russian word glasnost, different kinds of governmental administrative procedures that were less autocratic and dictatorial, that they called perestroika, which meant sharing of power. A number of individual Russians were criticizing the Soviet communist regime, most notably Andrei Sakharov. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was another, but he chose to exile himself and come to the United States, where, of course, he was received by conservatives like Jesse Helms with great enthusiasm. But Andrei Sakharov chose to stay in Russia. He ran a great risk. He was a nuclear physicist, and he spoke out against the arms race at great peril to himself. If he had not had such a great deal of prestige, he would have probably been sent to a prison camp in Siberia. But Sakharov actually ran for the legislature and won. He died shortly thereafter, but he's a great Russian, Soviet, and Russian hero. But meanwhile, the democratization movement increased. Mikhail Gorbachev really tried to accommodate. He was the last communist prime minister of Russia, the last communist premier. But his reforms didn't work, and finally communism fell. And on Christmas Day of 1991, December 25th, 1991, the Russian flag, the communist hammer and sickle was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, and Boris Yeltsin became the first non-communist leader of Russia in almost 80 years. In the rest of the world, the Arab-Israeli conflict continued to simmer, especially the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, which was called the Intifada, the revolt of the Palestinians against Israeli rule, continued. In Africa, there were a number of ferments and changes, but African countries during the 1980s were really struggling economically. They were struggling with democracy and undergoing a number of really serious issues. In Latin America, there was continued leftist uprisings against the oligarchic, landed, upper-class elites that dominated Latin America. The two most well-known revolts of poor people against the rich were in Nicaragua and El Salvador, where Reagan, we'll see, was supporting the upper classes. Now, in the United States, the year 1980 was a hugely important year politically in the United States. The year 1980 marks the victory of Ronald Reagan in the presidential campaign of 1980. He beat Jimmy Carter to a large extent because Carter represented with a dying liberalism He represented a lack of direction, and also, of course, remember the Iran hostage crisis was a major factor in helping Ronald Reagan to win the presidential election. Reagan is credited with bringing in what's called the Reagan Revolution, a new form of conservatism. Reagan had a very magnetic personality. He really appealed to a broad sector of the American population. He promised to bring back confidence. He promised to change the whole era of disillusionment and cynicism and lack of confidence which had characterized the 1970s after the fall of Vietnam and after Watergate and after the Arab oil boycott. Reagan promised to bring back confidence and patriotism. He also encouraged domestic conservatism a great deal. So there were organizations like the Moral Majority and Evangelical Christianity, which were given a great boost by the Reagan administration. Now, as far as the Soviets were concerned, Reagan was a pragmatist. His Secretary of State, Al Haig, often made very provocative statements against the Russians, which often worried our allies. But Reagan also recognized a need to end the arms race and a need to try to coexist with the Russians. And so he reached out on several occasions and negotiated with the Russians. So gradually there was a thaw in relations, even though there was a brief resurgence of the arms race for a couple of years because of some technological advances in arms. By the end of the 1980s, the relations with the Soviet Union had really relaxed a great deal, what we call détente. Détente is a French word which means relaxation. And then finally, communism fell on the last day, as I said, on Christmas Day of 1991. Now, Reagan also tried to change the course of the revolutions in Central America, and he was able to give support to pro-upper class conservative governments in Nicaragua and El Salvador. When he couldn't get the funding he needed from Congress, these organizations were often funded through covert CIA funds. And it came out that the CIA was actually using the Israelis to sell arms to the Iranians, and that the revenue from the arms sale to the Iranians was used to fund CIA activities in Central America in order that the CIA could bypass a congressional appropriation. And that was a huge scandal in the Reagan administration. And in other parts of the world, especially in the Far East, China continued to move forward economically, and really the Chinese sent several thousand Chinese students to America to be educated, and the Chinese began to adopt very capitalistic forms of economic development. At the same time, they significantly decreased a lot of their revolutionary rhetoric. They stopped supporting a lot of the leftist movements. China previously had presented itself as a supporter of global world revolution, but that was really definitely downplayed during the 1980s. So the Reagan Revolution, Reagan was a hardliner, but he was also a pragmatist. His Secretary of State was Jean Kilpatrick, who was the first female Secretary of State. And she often made a lot of, also like Al Haig, made a lot of provocative statements against the Russians. But she was also a very intelligent, highly intelligent, tough lady who supported the president. Reagan deliberately downplayed the NSC, the National Security Council. He really didn't like a lot of the power that Kissinger had during the Nixon and Ford administrations. And so Reagan deliberately promoted the National Security Council, and deliberately promoted the State Department over the National Security Council, and gave a lot of leeway to Gene Kilpatrick. So the Reagan years were years, first of all, of confrontation with the Russians, and then finally the collapse of communism. And though that occurred after Reagan left office, he often was given the credit for standing up to the Russians and causing them to cave in. Now, Reagan served 2 terms, from 1980 to 84, and from 84 to 88. In 88, his vice president, George Walker Bush, was elected president, and Bush had been a director of CIA. He knew a lot about world affairs. He was very savvy about covert activities and world affairs, and he had a great deal of experience, so he helped direct a lot of American foreign policy himself. So Bush served from 1988 to 1992. During that time, we were involved in the Gulf War. So I'm going to talk about the Gulf War in the next module, I think well, I'll talk about it in this module because I think we should focus. Let's talk about the Gulf War here in this section. Saddam Hussein, first of all, Iran got into a disastrous war. Iraq got into a disastrous war with Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a dictator. He tried to unite the Iraqi people by force and violence and intimidation. He nuked, or not nuked, he dropped chemical weapons on rebels, Kurdish rebels. Iraq was, and it still is today, a deeply divided nation. In fact, some people say that it's not even really a nation. And so there are the Kurds, there are the Shiites, there are the Sunnis, those are the 3 major groups. Now, in order to try to unite the people, Saddam first of all got into a war with Iran, which he lost, because the Iranians, Iran was a much larger, more powerful militarily country, and they really just defeated Saddam. Then his next military venture was to invade Kuwait. He claimed that Kuwait had oil, and Kuwait should have been a part of Iraq, and he invaded and took over Kuwait. Just before he invaded, he asked the American ambassador to Iraq whether the United States would mind if he invaded, and she said no. That really sort of gave him the green light to invade. Well, it turned out that the United States did mind, and there's a whole controversy over why she said what she did. But the United States did mind, and we led an international coalition to kick Saddam out of Kuwait. That was Operation Desert Storm in 1991 to 92. Now, we kicked Saddam out of Kuwait, but we didn't invade Iraq. So we left him in power in Iraq. We simply liberated the tiny sheikhdom of Kuwait, which was oil-rich. So by the end of 1991, this was under George Walker Bush, and by the end of 1991, the world was very much different. The United States was emerging as a major power, and the Cold War really was over, and the United States was unquestionably the most powerful country in the world in 1991. Now we'll go on and look at what happened with regard to America's rise to power after 1991, from 1991 to 2007.